Hi, gang. I've been looking forward to this week all semester because The Shining is one of my favorite ghost stories. It's not my favorite horror novel or even my favorite Stephen King novel, but when I reread this novel after I started teaching this course, it struck me that it might be the best example of ghost fiction I've ever encountered. I hope you really liked the novel and that this video enhances both your understanding and your enjoyment of it. Now, as I've mentioned, The Shining is a great choice to kick off the novel readings in this course because even though it is the novel assigned for the undead unit, it can be used as the novel for almost any paper you choose to write. I do want to caution you about one problem in writing about The Shining in your paper. Please, for the love of Mike, spell the name of the book correctly. It's on the cover of the book. You're staring at it right now. It's on the home page. It's on the syllabus. It's on the Masterwork cited sheet. And every semester, I get at least one paper that spells the title Shining throughout the paper. The spelling is Shining. Now, considering how many places it's written out for you, spelling the title wrong in your paper is just carelessness, and I really don't have any patience for that level of carelessness. So please, please make sure you spell the name of the title right. Another item to note is that we're discussing Stephen King's novel, The Shining, not Stanley Kubrick's 1980 film. Yeah, the two have the same name and the same characters and the same setting. But they're two completely different works of art. I'm going to add an extra section to this webpage that you don't have to study or even look at if you don't want to. But if you're interested in some of the theories as to why Kubrick made a movie that was so different from the book it was based on, you might find it interesting. But you don't have to study that. Not at all. Whether you do or not, keep in mind that in our discussions and in your paper, if you choose to write on The Shining, we're talking about the novel, not Kubrick's film. Let's start out by talking about some of the surface horrors in The Shining. As we noted when discussing European Gothic, the concept of haunted spaces has been a part of horror literature well, as long as there has been a horror literature. Some literature about the undead focuses on a single undead entity. For example, Bram Stoker's Dracula focuses on one vampire, and Wuthering Heights focuses on a man's obsession with one particular ghost. But others, like The Shining, are not about one single entity, but about a space that is haunted. Yeah, certain ghosts such as Lloyd the bartender and Delbert Grady, the former caretaker, stand out. But it's not really a single entity that is evil, it's the hotel itself. King's somewhat fond of the idea of haunted spaces. His lengthy and really excellent novel, It, is about a town named Derry, in Maine, of course, that is the feasting ground for an entity that wakens to feed on people at regular intervals. By the same token, the events in Pet Cemetery are caused by its proximity to an ancient Native American burial ground. And, well, we saw that 1408 is not about one ghost, but about an evil room. As Mike Ensslin points out in 1408, hotels are natural targets for haunting. We don't even want to know how many people have died from natural or unnatural causes in a hotel we visit. But we can generally assume there have been some, because so many people come and go. Besides, we also know that some people check into hotels to commit suicide so that their families don't have to cope with finding the body and cleaning up the mess. So we generally kind of know in the back of our minds that there's a pretty good chance that people have died in any hotel we stay in. And with that much potential for a number of deaths taking place within one space, hotels lend themselves very well to ghost fiction. King and other authors add to that the idea that a particular space is haunted because it is somehow a nexus of evil. In the United States, these fictional haunted spaces are sometimes attributed to cursed burial grounds, uh, which is what we see in the Poltergeist, and which also we see in terms of Native American burial grounds that have had their sacredness violated by white capitalism. Other times, though, there's no real explanation or even an attempt to offer an explanation. For example, we don't know why room 1408 is more haunted than any other room in that hotel. I mean, yeah, it's on the 13th floor, and 1 plus 4 plus 0 plus 8 equals 13. But that's not really an explanation. It's just an evil space because it's an evil space. But remember, supernatural horror by its nature doesn't have to have an empirical explanation because, as we talked about in the video on the undead, supernatural horror doesn't depend on empirical data because it's not based on events that can be accounted for or sometimes even experienced by our five senses. Now, yeah, there is some explanation about what makes the Overlook particularly ripe for haunting. And we learn that explanation through the scrapbook that Jack finds in the basement. The hotel changes ownership frequently, and most, if not all, of its owners have been connected to criminal activity, although the ties to organized crime are blurred by interlocking corporate ownerships that all seem somehow tied to Horace DeWitt, a land developer who might or might not have ties to the underworld. That's a lot of mights, which raises a lot of questions. Initially, Jack thinks tracing these ties to the underworld for a possible book is what has him so enthralled with the hotel's past. But, of course, that's not what has him so taken with the hotel's past. The hotel itself begins working its spell on Jack at a very early stage, and the scrapbook is one of the major tools that it uses to entice him in order to get Danny. Much of the horror in the novel is seen through Danny's eyes and through his shine. The first time Tony visits him, we hear the booming of what we later learn is a roque mallet, and we see the black and blue serpentine carpet in the hall where Jack later chases and nearly catches Danny. We learn the term red drum very early in the novel. We see blood outside and inside the presidential suite because Danny sees it. The shine visions are where much of the horror up to the climax of the novel lie. While Jack destroys the CB radio and throws a vital part of the snowmobile into the snow, there isn't really any actual violence in the story until after he escapes from the pantry. But there's a great deal of violence and horror spread throughout the novel in the form of Danny's visions, and later in the form of Jack's hallucinations. These visions and hallucinations become more horrific, of course, as the book progresses, and they provide much of the surface horror for the novel. Another horrific aspect of the novel that is presented very effectively on the surface is Jack's descent into madness. One of the ways that Kubrick's film differs from King's book is that Jack isn't really an extremely likable person even at the beginning of Kubrick's film. Of course, he gets much worse as the movie progresses. But in King's novel, Jack is a sympathetic character, particularly at the beginning of the book. No, he's not a perfect man. He's made some serious mistakes in life. But he's very human. He loves Wendy and Danny, and he's filled with remorse and guilt over breaking Danny's arm. In the beginning, his driving concern is with finding a way to provide for the family that he loves so much. But as soon as he finds that scrapbook, the Overlook begins working on him. At first, the effects are gradual and can even be written off to a combination of Jack's curiosity as a writer and his fight to recover from alcoholism. But the hold gets stronger and stronger until Jack basically becomes the embodiment of the hotel's evil. He loses his ability to determine the difference between reality and delusion. And we see him descend into madness. Because Jack doesn't suddenly lose his mind. It's a process. The process proceeds step by step, inch by inch. Throughout the novel, until the climax, Jack switches from periods of insanity, like when he destroys the CB radio, to periods of lucidity, when he has no idea why he has done what he's done, and he's horrified that he's done it. Even at the end, Danny is able to escape because for one brief moment, Jack becomes Jack again, and his love for Danny surfaces long enough to save the boy's life. Put yourself in Jack's shoes throughout this novel. How does it feel to lose your mind and know that you're behaving in ways that are contrary to everything you believe in? The Shining gives us some idea of how that feels. Of course, the most obvious of the surface horrors is the violence and implied violence. Danny's trapped in horrific visions portending violence throughout the novel, and his visions, as we've talked about, provide most of the surface horror throughout much of the book. It's through Danny's eyes that we see blood dripping down walls, a fire hose that becomes a snake, and hedges that come alive and attack. And of course, underlying the instances of all those visions is the booming sound of the roque mallet that we're introduced to very, very early in the novel. Now, of course, the ending of the novel is full-out suspense and horror. As Jack becomes increasingly drunk on the hotel and Dick Halloran races to the Overlook from Florida, we're confronted with scene after scene of growing fear and madness. The images appear more frequently and are increasingly horrific throughout the climax until the Overlook literally explodes from the pressure of its own evil insanity. Now that we've discussed some of the most obvious surface horrors that are clear when we initially read the novel, let's take a look at what we can see if we apply some of what we've learned so far in this course about horror. We'll begin with a brief look at how elements of both European and American Gothic literature are demonstrated in The Shining. The Overlook itself is an excellent example of the modernization of the European Gothic trope of castles and dungeons that tops the list on the handout by Robert Harris. As we've discussed, we don't have castles, huge monasteries, or underground catacombs in the United States, but that doesn't stop those elements of European Gothic from appearing in modern American horror. Like a castle, the Overlook is a huge structure with floors and floors of suites and rooms. Like a castle, there are nooks and crannies within the rooms that can go easily unnoticed and unseen. And of course, in any large structure with multiple divisions, it's possible for someone in the building to be completely unaware of what's going on in another part of the building. Those are some of the aspects of castles that made them popular settings in European Gothic, and they don't lose their potential for horror when we modernize them. Similarly, the basement of the Overlook is kind of like a medieval dungeon. It's dark, large, twisting, and filled with unsuspected evil that lurks in the shadows. The scrapbook that enraptures Jack and guides him into the Overlook spell is waiting for him as if it was something that had just been tossed aside and could be assumed to be harmless. But it's not harmless. And of course, in the basement you have the boiler, and the boiler is like an evil monster or dragon that has to be pacified to keep it from destroying everything around it. Another aspect of the Overlook that is reminiscent of European Gothic is the hallways. They're long and twisted and seemingly endless. Everything in the hallway as you walk down it looks so much alike that it would be really easy to get lost or turned around. In fact, you might have gotten turned around or lost in a hotel hallway in the past. I know I have. So the hallways of the hotel are like the underground catacombs and labyrinths that we see in European Gothic literature. And of course, the Overlook, like a castle, has a history. Just as the rulers who occupy a castle change with each generation and each coup, the ownership of the Overlook has changed several times, and many of the owners add new layers of shadiness to the hotel when they buy it. While the Overlook is a luxury hotel that offers all the conveniences available when the book was written, it really is a great modernization of an ancient castle, particularly once the snow has cut off access to mass communication. The Gothic element from Harris's list that is most obviously demonstrated in The Shining is visions. As we've already talked about, much of the surface horror in the novel occurs in Danny's visions of the future, and the mystery and suspense lie in attempting to understand what Danny's visions mean. King heightens the horror and suspense created in the visions by putting them in the mind of a small child. Despite his unique gift and considerable intelligence, Danny is a little boy. Like all very young children, he doesn't even really understand the meanings of what he sees in his actual reality. For example, he doesn't know what being drunk is, but he does know that there is something he calls the bad stuff that makes his father act in strange ways. He doesn't know what mental illness is, even though one of his schoolmates' fathers had been hospitalized for one. But he does know that people get taken away because of things that happen in their minds, and he's scared that he might get taken away because of his shine. Naturally, a boy that young who can't even fully interpret the meanings of the actual reality around him would never conceive of the depths of evil that his visions of what will happen at the Overlook imply. All he knows, and therefore all we know as readers, is that there is some kind of booming sound, an angry voice, and a feeling of terror that is so strong that it is palpable. Yeah, Danny's shine is integral to the novel, and the title of the novel clearly emphasizes that. For one thing, Danny's strong shine is clearly what gives the Overlook heightened power. In 1408, the evil is powerful enough that it is always living in that room, and anyone who enters the room is in danger of being swept away by it. But it takes Danny's shine to bring the Overlook the power that it needs to be the lively, multi-generational party that it is. As the scene with the clock symbolizes, Danny is the key that winds the Overlook up. Obviously, the events of the novel wouldn't have taken place if Danny didn't shine. But the shine in his visions are also handy writing conventions. A sense of suspense is often created in literature by foreshadowing, and in works that build off a foundation of suspense, one way to create it is to hint at what will happen in the novel in such encoded ways that the reader is caught up in the suspense without fully understanding what lies beneath it. Just as Danny is caught up in the fear of what he shines, even though he doesn't fully understand its meaning. Without Danny's shine, without those visions, The Shining would be the novel of Jack's slow descent into homicidal madness, and that would be a good book, but it wouldn't be nearly as effective in terms of horror. Another item from Harris's list of elements of the European Gothic that is obviously demonstrated in The Shining is supernatural events. They begin, of course, with Danny's tour of the Overlook and his discussions with Dick Halloran. But they actually become more dangerous as Danny visits the playground where he encounters something in the cement rings buried in the snow and then is chased by the topiary animals. The supernatural events begin increasing in pace and severity once Jack sees Lloyd the bartender, and they continue to become more frequent and more severe until the climactic explosion of the hotel. The explosion, of course, isn't supernatural at all. It's a very natural event that occurs because the supernatural life of the hotel has become so powerful and engrossing that the natural life about the hotel is completely forgotten by everyone except, as Tony has foretold, by Danny. A final element of European Gothic from Harris's list that we'll discuss is the inclusion of a woman who is threatened by an impulsive, tyrannical male. It's pretty obvious that Jack is somewhat impulsive. The incident that leads to Danny's arm being broken is definitely an incident of impulse. Jack just grabs Danny so quickly and with so little thought that he isn't even aware of the strength that he's using. Another impulse Jack gives into leads him to smash the CB radio. And then, of course, a third leads him to throw a vital part of the snowmobile's engine into the snow. So I think it's fair to say that Jack is impulsive. Also, he's something of a tyrant, even though he's a much more empathetic and loving character in King's novel than he is in Kubrick's movie. Partially due to the Overlook's desires and influence, Jack refuses to seriously consider taking Wendy and Danny to safety, even after the incident in room 213. Of course, he views his insistence on staying as a demonstration of concern for the family's financial future, and to some degree that is a motivation. But most tyrants convince themselves that what they want is good for everyone in the long run. And naturally, this view takes an increasingly strong hold on him as the Overlook tightens its grip on his mind, and eventually Jack essentially becomes the tyrannical embodiment of the Overlook's evil, which is when Wendy and Danny are truly in danger. The final Gothic element we're going to discuss is an element of the American Gothic. Isolation plays a huge role in The Shining. In fact, we are warned about the potential dangers that isolation poses when Jack initially interviews with Overlook manager Stuart Ullman. Ullman, who shines about as much as a black hole, is completely out of touch with the Overlook's evil. So he attributes Grady's killing of his family and himself to cabin fever and alcohol. While isolation is not the direct cause of anything that happens to the Torrances at the Overlook, it is very significant in the hotel's ability to have the influence over them that it has. It's probably really difficult for people who haven't lived in an area that has true winter to understand the effect that winter has on people. A few inches of snow, even 3 to 6 inches, can bring even a city to a grinding halt. There's simply no way to clear snow off roads as quickly as it can fall and fill them up again. People are faced with digging their cars out of several inches of snow in weather that is so cold that the air hurts any skin that is exposed. And in more rural areas, electrical and communication lines are downed by the weight of the snow. Even now, in the 21st century, people find themselves trapped in their homes with no electricity for up to 2 or 3 days. And in some winters, they dig themselves out to a normal life, only to see the same thing happen again a week or 2 later because of another snowstorm. Now that's in cities. And cities are cleared of snow and dug out long before the rural areas are. So living in a rural area in the winter can be very isolating and to some degree dangerous. That's in just an area that has normal winter weather. Truly serious winter weather in the Rockies, which is what the Torrances face, leads to paralyzed isolation. The closest town to Overlook is the small town of Sidewinder, which probably has enough to do to keep its citizens dug out since it isn't a wealthy community. Digging out a hotel that won't be open for several months isn't going to be a priority in a case like that, especially when chances are good that another snowstorm will bury the roads within a few days of their being cleared. So Ullman isn't completely stupid in believing that isolation that lasts for months is what led Grady to kill his family. That level and length of isolation has been known to lead to insanity, including homicidal and suicidal insanity, even if it's not in an evil hotel. The real effect that isolation has on the Torrances, though, is that it forms entrapment. Wendy and Danny can't leave the Overlook, and they can't escape Jack once he becomes enthralled. As Jack tells Wendy, even attempting to get to Sidewinder on the snowmobile would be potentially fatal because of the exposure. Once Jack renders the snowmobile inoperable, there is no way to leave, and once he destroys the CB radio, There's no way to contact the outside world. The Torrances are trapped and isolated in evil. As we recall, literary critic Gina Whisker says that one element that literary works rely on to create horror is defamiliarizing the familiar. Certainly, The Overlook is a good example of a familiar environment that is bizarrely and horrifyingly defamiliarized. As Mike Insland points out in 1408, hotel rooms are designed to be familiar even if we've never visited that particular hotel. They rely heavily on a cognitive function called schema. A schema is like a script that the mind creates for environments and situations that we encounter frequently. For example, we all have schema for a classroom. The schema includes some kind of seating with a writing surface, and all of those seats are faced in the same direction, which we think of as the front of the room. And then there's a desk or a table at the front, usually with the chair that's facing in the opposite direction of all the other seats in the room. We also expect to see something on the wall to write on, a chalkboard or a whiteboard, and usually some kind of a projector screen. That is our schema for a classroom. If we walk into what we think is a classroom and find a bathtub, a stove, a fire hydrant, and a neon sign, we're going to think we're in the wrong place because those features don't match our schema for a classroom. Now, hotel rooms use these schema to make an unfamiliar environment feel familiar. All hotel rooms have certain aspects in common. They all at least have one bed, right? And there's usually some kind of table or desk that serves as a writing surface. Most of the time, or at least quite often, there's a mini fridge. And we know that there's going to be bedside tables and a TV and a bathroom that will probably be off to one side, usually near the door to the room. In our schema, we know that there will be one or more windows and the heating or cooling unit is usually beneath them, and that the art on the walls isn't going to be anything particularly special. We also know that a hotel room has rather nondescript carpet that isn't very thick, and some kind of a printed bedspread and matching curtains that completely shut out the light. Now, we aren't treated to the view of many of the Overlook's actual guest rooms, but we can assume that the rooms are like those of other hotel rooms because the Overlook as a whole matches our schema for a hotel at the beginning of the novel. There's a registration desk complete with a cashier, a lobby with sofas and comfortable chairs, a staircase, and an elevator. There's also a huge circular drive for loading and unloading cars and valet parking. This is all pretty much standard stuff at better hotels throughout the Western world. And if we aren't that familiar with snow in Las Vegas, if there's anything we do know, it's hotels. But as the horror in the novel increases, the Overlook is defamiliarized. Animal-shaped hedges that come to life and attack you are hardly a familiar sight. A bloated, decaying woman getting out of the bathtub in an empty hotel is not familiar. The elevator that's filled with confetti in a building that hasn't seen a party in 3 months is not a familiar sight. And certainly that bizarre man in the dog costume performing tricks isn't familiar to us. The further the novel progresses, the more the Overlook is defamiliarized. And that's an element that adds horror to the novel. Interestingly, Jack doesn't seem to be bothered much by the defamiliarization of the familiar. In fact, he seems to almost feel more at home in some ways in the defamiliarized Overlook than he does before things get weird. Part of the genius of the Overlook's evil is how it uses settings familiar to and loved by Jack's mind to further enthrall him. What could be a more natural way to capture the attention of a curious writer than by tossing the scrapbook of an unnamed person in his path? And what better way could there be to attract and hold a recovering alcoholic than a gala celebration with free-flowing alcohol and deeply inebriated celebrants? But the Overlook uses Jack's needs against him on a deeper level, too. Jack is an educated man, a published writer, and a former teacher at an exclusive college preparatory academy. That's what he has been, and it's how he sees himself. He doesn't see himself as a caretaker and fix-it man who earns his living by working with his hands. He feels out of place in the job, and he tends to blame his reduced circumstances on others. Oh, no, he didn't set the timer ahead when his debate student George Hatfield claimed he did. Of course he didn't. And even if he did, it was because he wanted to save the kid embarrassment, not because the kid was rich and good-looking and had had everything handed to him his whole life. Oh, yeah, he had hit George, but that was George's fault because he slashed Jack's tires instead of being kicked off the debate team as his medicine. Oh, yes, he had broken Danny's arm, but that was because the darn kid messed with his papers. Yeah, Jack sees himself as a victim, as a man who has been kicked out of his just station in life by the acts of others. He's better than his job, and he desperately wants to return to a life where he is one of the respected elite givers of commands instead of followers of commands. The Overlook appeals to Jack's vision of himself as being better than his job and offers him an opportunity to become important if he just gives Danny to the Overlook. So it makes sense that Jack is comfortable as the Overlook becomes defamiliarized to Wendy and Danny, because his environment is aligning itself with his desires and with his view of himself. The pattern that the defamiliarization follows is actually familiar to Jack because it's pulled from his own mind. The Shining presents a unique approach to defamiliarizing the familiar by pulling the unfamiliar elements from the central character's mind so that he is perfectly comfortable in the altered environment while everyone else is completely horrified. But it's not only familiar places that can be defamiliarized. Familiar people can be defamiliarized too. And we noticed this, of course, in studying Ghosts with Teeth. Except for the horrific scene in the basement, the physical environment in that story doesn't change. It's the people, beginning with Maud and her discolored teeth, that are defamiliarized. Similarly, Jack is defamiliarized in The Shining. We've noted that Jack changes slowly at first, and the rapidity of his changes accelerates as he becomes more enthralled by the Overlook. By the end of the novel, he is, as Danny notes, not Jack at all, but only a moving, homicidal embodiment of the Overlook's evil. But King makes an unusual move in defamiliarizing Jack, too. Just as the Overlook in some ways becomes more familiar to Jack as it takes him over, the initial changes in Jack are all too familiar to Wendy. Spending time by himself, wiping his mouth, and chewing etc. are all habits that Jack had when he was drinking heavily, and they're very familiar to his wife. In fact, they provide her with the sign that something is wrong with Jack, something that could lead to the destruction of the family. King's use of defamiliarization of the familiar in The Shining is very artful because it portrays the defamiliarization as familiarization to some characters. It's as if the defamiliarization folds back and forth on itself. Now, of course, casual readers of the novel wouldn't notice this aspect, but once we study horror as a literary form, these manipulations make this piece even more interesting to read and consider. If there's one element of horror that The Shining particularly exemplifies, it's the paradox of the past. The past haunts the novel in several ways, and in each case it rises like the wasps to sting everyone involved. The influence that Jack's childhood has on the events of the novel are somewhat obvious. Jack's father was a dominating, abusive man who believed that his family had to take their medicine. Although Jack had loved him when he was a boy, at the beginning of the novel, Jack realizes that the way his father had treated his family was, well, wrong. Among Jack's many desires is the desire to be different from his father. He wants to avoid having his father's temper, He wants to avoid creating a family that is under his thumb, but not close to him because he is an object of fear. But as the Overlook works its spell, Jack begins to see that his father's actions might have been justified. In the climactic scene, of course, he echoes his father's words when he threatens Danny. He has, ironically, become most like the parent he least wants to resemble. A rather similar situation occurs with Wendy. Wendy's childhood is scarred by her mother's jealousy of her relationship with her father. She resents the fact that Wendy is closer to her father than she is to her, and her resentment grows throughout Wendy's lifetime. One of the reasons that Wendy and Danny are trapped at the Overlook is that Wendy doesn't see staying with her mother as an option. But like Jack, she ends up sharing with her mother the traits that she found most difficult to deal with. She finds herself being jealous that Danny appears to be closer to Jack, even though Jack has broken his arm while Wendy's never hurt him. Of course, Wendy's jealousy of Danny's relationship with Jack is less serious than Wendy's mother's jealousy was, but who knows how much it might have grown if Jack had not been killed when Danny was 5. The influence of Wendy's past on the events of the novel are also, of course, much less serious than Jack's, because Wendy isn't taken over by the Overlook. But in both cases, neither adult can go back and change their childhoods, but they also can't escape the influence their childhoods have over their adult lives. Their childhoods are part of the paradox of the past. Jack and Wendy's shared past is another example of how the paradox of the past affects The Shining. The events of the novel take place during a time when Jack and Wendy are attempting to recover from a particularly troubled period in their marriage. We learn early in the book that prior to its beginning, the Torrance family had almost been destroyed, largely due to Jack's drinking. The most significant event related to his drinking had been when Jack had accidentally broken Danny's arm. Jack himself recalls that the snap of Danny's arm is actually a snap in his relationship with Wendy. It represents a break between everything that had gone on in their relationship before that incident and everything that goes on after it, because everything in the relationship after that point is viewed in the context of that incident. Until the Overlook is largely controlling Jack's thoughts, he's filled with guilt and remorse about breaking Danny's arm, so his approach to his marriage is colored by that single incident. He also believes that Wendy's view of and approach to their marriage is colored by that accident, and to a degree, it is. Certainly in the period immediately following the arm break, Wendy's attitude towards Jack and her marriage is so altered that she considers divorce. Fortunately, Jack decides to stop drinking, and as Danny tells us, the relationship improves so that divorce is no longer considered. But drinking isn't Jack's only problem. He also has problems controlling his temper. As the relationship is beginning to heal after the arm break, Jack has a physical fight with George Hatfield, a student, and he loses his job. The resulting emotional and financial strains also have serious effects on Jack and Wendy's marriage. The effects of these two incidents in the Torrance marriage demonstrate that the paradox of the past are very significant in the development of The Shining. I think it's safe to assume that if Jack could, he would return to the past and erase both of those incidents, at least until he becomes enthralled by the Overlook. He regrets both actions, which result from his temper, as soon as he sees what he's done. But for Jack, as for us, the past is gone. He can't recapture it and change it. He broke Danny's arm, and he hit a student, and those are unalterable facts. So Jack accepts the job at the Overlook for 2 reasons. First, of course, he has to put a roof over his family's head and food on their table, and in 1977, when The Shining was published, that was still considered to be largely the man's responsibility. Now, it's true that the women's movement of the 1970s led many women to accept their share of that responsibility. But in the man's eyes, and to some degree in society's eyes, making a living was still the man's responsibility. In fact, men often define their masculinity, at least in part, by their ability to provide for their family. But Jack also accepts the job at the Overlook for another reason. He sees it as a first step in rebuilding his professional reputation. As we've discussed, Jack doesn't view himself as a laborer, which, unfortunately and incorrectly, is viewed as inferior in our culture. He sees himself as a professional man and an artist. As Jack tells Ullman, he sees the job at the Overlook as an opportunity to finish his play, and we know that means that it will restore his reputation and his self-perception as an artist. We also learned that his former drinking buddy, Al Shockley, is working to get him reinstated at Stovington Academy. So, ironically, Jack views his position at the Overlook as an opportunity to recover from the past. And in the beginning, it seems to work. But the inability to recapture the past is only part of the paradox. The other half is that we can't escape it. Clearly, Jack can't escape the past. He can't escape the effects that his actions have had on his family and his relationships. Thoughts of and remorse and guilt over breaking Danny's arm are with him every day, and thoughts of his encounter with George Hatfield are almost as frequent. The internal consequences of the past are always with him. The external consequences are with him too. His drinking and his breaking Danny's arm do affect Wendy's view of him. She still loves him, and she's committed to staying with him, but she doesn't completely trust him. Yes, once they get to the Overlook, she knows he isn't drinking, but she's suspicious that something unusual is going on with him, and she discusses that with Danny. Although, as Danny notes, Jack and Wendy are happier than they had been when thoughts of divorce were circulating in their minds, the knowledge of what had occurred is still with them and continues to affect their relationship. And then, of course, obviously, the external effects of the confrontation with George Hatfield are very prevalent in Jack's life. If that fight hadn't occurred, Jack would most likely still be teaching at Stovington Academy. The family's financial situation would be fine. Jack wouldn't be worried about his professional future, and they never would have gone to the Overlook to begin with. No, Jack can't recapture a past that he desperately wishes he could change, and he can't escape the influence that the past has on his life. He's caught in the paradox of the past, and when he accepts the job at the Overlook, he sees it as an opportunity to distance himself from the past and heal. But the Overlook offers Jack anything but an opportunity to distance himself from the past. It engulfs him in a past of its own and eventually drowns him in it. Now, Jack learns from the scrapbook and from library research that the Overlook itself has a colorful past, as we talked about. But the Overlook's past is dormant and harmless to anyone who doesn't shine, at least until Danny arrives. For example, unlike in the film 1408, most people could enter room 217 at the Overlook without any problems at all. One chambermaid, whom Dick Halloran says shines a little, sees the bloated corpse of the woman in the bathtub, and of course Dick sees it himself. But for most people, there's just nothing there. Until Danny arrives at the Overlook, that is. Danny's strong shine allows the Overlook's past to assert itself to more people and in more physical ways. Dick Halloran tells Danny that what he sees in the Overlook is just pictures that can't hurt anyone. And that's true until Danny's power brings the mental pictures to life. Because of Danny's powerful shine, the woman in 217 gets out of the tub and the topiary animals come to life and attack Dick on the road from Sidewinder. Because of Danny's shine, the Overlook is able to grow powerful enough to get into Jack's mind as more than just pictures. It's able to get him drunk on alcohol that isn't actually there. And it's able to animate Grady to the point that he can physically open the door to the pantry and release Jack. But the Overlook under the influence of Danny's shine is a temporal anomaly. There actually is no past at the Overlook because all the various eras of the Overlook's history exist at the same time. The attendants at the party Jack attends in the ballroom are from 1927, 1945, 1977, and every year in between. The hotel destroys the paradox of the past because the past doesn't need to be recaptured. It isn't really the past at all, but an everlasting present that just goes on and on and on. Now, this temporal anomaly, which obliterates the past by making it eternally present, would particularly appeal to someone who is trying to break with his own past. On the surface, it gives Jack a different past to focus on, one in which a small boy's broken arm and a confrontation with a high school student are wiped out completely. Jack's personal past is changed too, because Grady tells him that he has always been the caretaker of the Overlook. And altering Jack's past also alters his future. Both Lloyd and Grady tell Jack that the Overlook's management is interested in him, from which Jack infers that he has potential to move up in the organization. The Overlook offers Jack a different past and a better future, and all he has to do is give Danny to the hotel. That assignment becomes easier for him to fulfill because the past, which is the eternal present at the Overlook, changes Jack's views of family interactions and family structure. Not only is he no longer appalled by his father, he actually slowly begins to share his father's views of the importance of being the monarch of the family and disciplining its other members if they dare to thwart his goals. By the climax, Jack is more his father than he is Jack, and more the Overlook than he is his father. With his own past and his remorse and guilt over them obliterated, Jack becomes the locus of two violent pasts that merge in the climactic scene, and that's the past of his childhood and father and the past of the Overlook. Now, by creating a past that is eternally, physically the present, the Overlook destroys the paradox of the past because, as we noted, there's no reason to recapture it. But that simply leaves Jack with the other half of the paradox. He can't escape it. He's drawn into the Overlook to the point that his self is all but nullified, and he can't escape except for one brief moment of clarity that allows Danny to flee his homicidal attack. He can't control the Overlook's past. It controls him. The great irony of The Shining is that Jack goes to the Overlook to distance himself from the past and ends up being destroyed by the past. Okay, we've looked, at least on an initial level, at some of the things that are going on in The Shining. Personally, I find this book much more interesting than I did when I read it in the summer of 1978, which was the summer when the paperback was released. When I first read it, I was caught up in the plot and characters, and those were really good. But when I started teaching this course and learning about horror literature, and then went back and reread this novel, I saw all these different layers coming into play, and that made the book even better. That's really what I hope this class does for you, beyond the 3 months that you and I talk to each other. If you chose this class, you probably liked horror to begin with. And I really hope that beginning to see things that are beneath the surface of horror books and movies makes them even cooler to you. Don't ever forget that your mind is your toy and the universe is your playground. The more ways that we can look at the world around us, including the books we read and the movies and TV shows that we watch, the more interesting it all is. Of course, if you have any questions about this video or anything in the course, email me from an account other than Canvas at deborah.oakey@csn.edu. We'll talk again soon.